Imagine walking through a forest at twilight, when the air grows heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees stand silent around you, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But beneath your feet, in the darkness of the soil, an entirely different world is alive with conversation. Trees, it turns out, are not the silent sentinels we've always imagined them to be. They talk, they share, they remember, and tonight we're going to discover exactly how they do it. Welcome to Bedtime Biology, where science meets serenity. Each night, we explore the quiet wonders of the natural world, calming your mind and sparking your curiosity. Please like the video, subscribe for more like this, and comment below with where you're checking in from. The idea that trees might communicate with one another would have seemed like fantasy just a few decades ago. When scientists first suggested it, they were met with skepticism, sometimes even ridicule. Trees, after all, have no brains, no nervous systems, no voices. How could they possibly talk? But as researchers began to look more closely at what happens beneath the forest floor, they discovered something remarkable. Trees are connected to one another through vast underground networks, intricate webs of communication that allow them to share resources, send warnings, and even recognize their own offspring. It's a hidden language that's been spoken for millions of years, and we're only just beginning to understand it. Tonight, we'll journey deep into the soil to explore the mycorrhizal networks that link tree to tree like a biological internet. We'll drift through the forest air, following invisible chemical messages that travel on the breeze. We'll trace the electrical signals that pulse through tree trunks, remarkably similar to the nerve impulses in our own bodies. We'll meet the mother trees, ancient giants that nurture their young and share their wisdom with the forest around them. And we'll discover how all of this communication isn't just fascinating science. It's essential to the survival of forests and, ultimately, to our own well-being. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let your mind wander thou through these forests of wonder. The trees have stories to tell, and tonight we're going to listen. The underground internet, mycorrhizal networks. Beneath every forest floor, hidden from view in the perpetual darkness of the soil, lies a network so vast and intricate that it rivals anything humans have ever built. This is the mycorrhizal network, sometimes called the Wood Wide Web, and it represents one of nature's most sophisticated communication systems. To understand how trees talk, we must first understand mycorrhizae. The word itself comes from the Greek, mykes, meaning fungus, and rhiza, meaning root. Mycorrhizae are the partnerships between fungi and plant roots, relationships so ancient and so fundamental that they may have been essential to plants colonizing land in the first place hundreds of millions of years ago. These are not parasitic relationships where one organism simply takes from another. They are true symbioses, mutually beneficial arrangements, where both partners gain something essential for their survival. Here's how it works. Trees, through the miracle of photosynthesis, create sugars from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. These sugars are the tree's currency, its fuel, its very life force. But trees need more than just sugars to thrive. They need nitrogen, phosphorus, and a host of other minerals that must be extracted from the soil. This is where the fungi come in. Fungal filaments, called hyphae, finer than the finest human hair, can penetrate into tiny soil crevices that tree roots could never reach. They can access nutrients locked in mineral grains, and they can break down organic matter to release the elements trees need. The fungi thread their way through the soil in vast networks of mycelium, exploring, foraging, gathering. When they find nutrients, they absorb them and transport them back to the tree roots they're partnered with. In exchange, the fungi receive a steady supply of the sugars the tree creates, sugars the fungi cannot make for themselves. Scientists have found that fungi can consume about 30% of all the sugars a tree produces through photosynthesis. That's a substantial fee, but it's one that trees are willing to pay because the services provided are invaluable. But the mycorrhizal network does something even more remarkable than this basic exchange. It connects trees to one another. A single fungal individual might link its mycelium with the roots of dozens or even hundreds of different trees. In a natural forest, researchers have found that nearly every tree is connected to every other tree through this underground web. In British Columbia, Canada, ecologist Suzanne Simard discovered that a single mother tree, an old Douglas fir, could be connected to over 40 other trees through mycorrhizal fungi. And when you consider that forests contain not just one, but many such hub trees, the potential for connection becomes almost limitless. Through these fungal highways, trees can do something that once seemed impossible. They can share resources. In 1997, Simard conducted a groundbreaking experiment that would change our understanding of forests forever. She wanted to know if trees of different species, competing for the same sunlight, water, and nutrients, would nevertheless share resources through fungal networks. She worked with paper birch and Douglas fir, two species that often grow together in the forests of Western Canada. Simard grew birch and fir seedlings and allowed them to form mycorrhizal connections. Then she did something clever. She gave the birch trees carbon dioxide enriched with carbon-13, a heavier isotope of carbon, while the fir trees received carbon dioxide marked with carbon-14, a radioactive isotope. Both isotopes are absorbed during photosynthesis and converted into sugars. If her hypothesis was correct, if trees really did share through fungal networks, then she should be able to detect carbon-13 in the fir trees and carbon-14 in the birch trees. And that's exactly what she found. The trees were exchanging carbon, actual food, through the fungal connections that linked them. When she shaded the Douglas fir seedlings, making it difficult for them to photosynthesize, she found that the birch trees increased their transfer of carbon to the struggling firs, as if sensing their distress and responding with assistance. In autumn and spring, when the deciduous birch trees had no leaves, the exchange reversed, and the evergreen firs sent carbon to support the birch until they could photosynthesize again. This was cooperation on a scale that no one had imagined possible. The implications of this discovery are profound. It means that trees in a forest are not simply competing with one another for resources, though competition certainly exists. They are also cooperating, sharing, supporting one another through times of stress. The network acts as a kind of insurance policy. When one tree is thriving and has excess resources, it can share them with neighbors who are struggling. Later, when circumstances change, that generosity might be returned. It's a form of reciprocal altruism, similar to what we see in social animals, but played out through fungal networks in the soil. But how exactly do resources move through these networks? Scientists are still working to fully understand the mechanisms, but several pathways seem to be at play. One is simple physics. Resources tend to flow from areas of abundance to areas of scarcity, from source to sink. A tree growing in full sunlight, producing more sugars than it immediately needs, becomes a source. A shaded seedling, struggling to make enough food to survive, becomes a sink. The concentration gradient drives the flow of resources through the connecting fungi. There's also evidence that the fungi themselves play an active role in regulating these transfers. The fungi have their own interests to consider. They want to keep all their tree partners alive and healthy, because that ensures a continued supply of sugars. So the fungi may actively redistribute resources in ways that maximize the health of the entire network. A fungus might take sugars from a tree that has plenty and deliver them to a tree that's starving, not out of any sense of morality, but simply because keeping all partners alive is the best strategy for the fungus's own survival. The network can also transmit more than just food. Water moves through these fungal highways, especially important during droughts. Minerals like nitrogen and phosphorus flow from older trees with deep roots that can access deeper soil layers to younger trees with shallow roots. Defense compounds can be shared, priming nearby trees to resist insect attacks or disease. And, remarkably, information itself can be transmitted through the network in the form of chemical and electrical signals. When a tree is attacked by insects, it doesn't suffer in silence. It releases chemical signals into the network, alarm calls that spread through the fungal filaments to neighboring trees. These trees, receiving the warning, can then preemptively activate their own defenses, producing toxic or distasteful compounds in their leaves before the insects ever arrive. Studies on Douglas fir trees have shown that seedlings connected to a mycorrhizal network respond faster and more effectively to insect threats than isolated trees that lack these connections. The network provides not just resources, but information, a kind of early warning system that helps the entire forest prepare for danger. Scientists have discovered that the structure of these mycorrhizal networks has some surprising similarities to other kinds of networks, both natural and artificial. The networks show what mathematicians call scale-free properties and small world characteristics. In plain language, this means that a few trees, the biggest and oldest ones, have vastly more connections than average, acting as hubs in the network, while most trees have just a moderate number of connections. This architecture is eerily similar to the structure of the internet, social networks, and even neural networks in the brain. These hub trees, which Suzanne Simard has called mother trees, play a critical role in forest health. They are typically the largest, oldest trees in the forest, with the most extensive root systems, and therefore the most fungal connections. Through their deep roots, they can access water and nutrients from soil layers that younger trees can't reach. They pump resources up from these depths and share them through the network, supporting seedlings and saplings that would otherwise struggle to survive in the shade of the canopy. Mother trees also seem capable of something even more remarkable. They can recognize their own offspring. In experiments, researchers have shown that when a mother tree's seedlings are growing nearby, connected to the same mycorrhizal network, the mother tree preferentially sends more carbon and nutrients to her own genetic offspring than to unrelated seedlings. How she recognizes her kin remains a mystery. Some scientists speculate it might be through chemical signatures, scent molecules that tree roots can detect. But trees have no nose, no olfactory receptors like those in animals. The mechanism of recognition remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of tree communication. The mycorrhizal network isn't just a passive pipeline. It's dynamic, constantly changing, responding to the needs of the forest. In experiments where researchers have injured or stressed a tree, they've found that nearby trees connected to the network respond almost immediately. Defense enzymes become activated. Resource sharing increases. It's as if the network has a kind of collective intelligence, a distributed consciousness that emerges from the interactions of thousands of individual organisms, each following simple rules, but together creating something far more complex. Consider what happens when a mother tree dies. You might think that her death would create a hole in the network, a loss of connection and resources. But researchers have found something different. As a mother tree approaches death, whether from old age, disease, or injury, she doesn't hoard her remaining resources. Instead, she does the opposite. She dumps massive amounts of carbon into the network, transferring her stored wealth to the younger trees around her, especially to her offspring. It's as if she's leaving an inheritance, passing on her accumulated resources to the next generation. Trees growing near dying, mother trees, receive a significant boost that can help them survive and thrive long after the old tree has fallen. Even after death, the mycorrhizal network persists. The fungi don't die when the tree dies. They remain in the soil, continuing to connect living trees, facilitating the flow of resources and information. In some cases, if a tree is cut down, but its root system remains intact and connected to the network, those roots can stay alive for years, even centuries, sustained by sugars from neighboring trees. In European forests, researchers have found ancient beech stumps, cut 400 or 500 years ago, that are still green with chlorophyll beneath the bark, still living, still connected, still receiving food from surrounding trees that weren't even alive when the original tree fell. The existence of mycorrhizal networks has profound implications for how we think about forests. For decades, foresters have focused on individual trees, viewing forests as collections of competing individuals, where the goal was to remove competition to help the most valuable trees grow faster. But the science of mycorrhizal networks tells a different story. It suggests that forests are more like superorganisms, integrated networks, where cooperation is just as important as competition. Removing the biggest, oldest trees, the mother trees, doesn't just harvest valuable timber. It disrupts the network, removes the hubs, and can cause cascading effects that weaken the entire forest's resilience. There's still so much we don't know about these underground networks. Scientists are just beginning to map them, to understand their complexity, to decode the signals that pass through them. Every teaspoon of healthy forest soil contains miles of fungal filaments, and those filaments are constantly exchanging messages, nutrients, and warnings among thousands of trees. It's a conversation that's been ongoing for millions of years, long before humans walked the earth. And it's a conversation that continues tonight, in every forest around the world, in the dark and quiet spaces beneath your feet. The language of chemicals, volatile organic compounds. While the underground mycorrhizal networks represent one method of tree communication, trees also speak through the air. They release into the atmosphere thousands of different volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, chemicals that evaporate easily and drift on the wind, carrying messages across the forest canopy. If you've ever walked through a pine forest, and breathed in that distinct resinous scent, you've experienced tree communication firsthand. That smell is composed of volatile organic compounds, mainly terpenes like alpha-pinene and beta-pinene, released by the pine trees all around you. But these compounds aren't produced for our enjoyment. They serve crucial functions for the trees themselves, functions related to defense, attraction, and communication. Trees produce VOCs for many reasons. Some compounds deter insects or other herbivores, making the tree's leaves taste terrible or even toxic. Other compounds attract pollinators to flowers or animals that will disperse seeds. Still, others have antimicrobial properties, protecting the tree from bacteria and fungi. But many VOCs also function as signals, messages sent from one tree to another, warnings of danger or calls for help. The chemical vocabulary of trees is extraordinarily diverse. Scientists have identified hundreds to thousands of different VOCs that various tree species can produce. These include terpenes and terpenoids, a huge family of compounds that includes isoprene, monoterpenes like pinene and limonene, and sesquiterpenes. There are also green leaf volatiles, compounds released when leaf tissue is damaged. Methyl salicylate, related to aspirin, acts as a defense signal. Ethylene, a simple gas, plays multiple roles in plant communication and development. Each compound, each blend of compounds, can convey different information. One of the most studied examples of tree communication through VOCs comes from the African savanna, where acacia trees and giraffes have been engaged in an evolutionary arms race for millions of years. Acacia trees are a primary food source for giraffes. A single giraffe can consume up to 29 kilograms of acacia leaves and twigs in a single day. This kind of intense browsing pressure represents a serious threat to the trees, and the acacias have evolved multiple defenses. The first line of defense is physical. Acacia trees bristle with thorns, some species sporting spines as long as 8 to 10 centimeters, sharp as needles. But giraffes have evolved in response, developing long tongues, sometimes 45 centimeters or more, covered in thick, tough tissue that can navigate around the thorns to pluck the nutritious leaves. So, the acacia trees deployed a chemical defense. When a giraffe begins eating their leaves, the trees respond within minutes by pumping tannins into their foliage. Tannins are bitter, astringent compounds that interfere with digestion by binding to proteins. For giraffes, leaves full of tannins taste awful and become much harder to digest. Studies have shown that tannin concentrations in acacia leaves can increase by 70% within just 2 minutes of the leaves being damaged. The longer a giraffe feeds on a tree, the more bitter the leaves become, until finally the animal gives up and moves on to another tree. But here's where the communication becomes truly remarkable. When an acacia tree is being browsed by a giraffe, it doesn't just protect itself, it warns its neighbors. The tree releases ethylene gas, a volatile organic compound that drifts on the breeze to other acacia trees downwind. When those trees detect the ethylene signal, they respond by preemptively increasing their own tannin production, even though they haven't yet been touched by a giraffe. Within 30 minutes of detecting the ethylene warning, neighboring trees have raised their defenses, making their leaves just as bitter and unappetizing as the tree being actively browsed. This has profound implications for the giraffe's feeding behavior. If a giraffe starts eating from a tree and then simply moves to the next tree downwind, it will find those leaves are now also bitter. Scientists observing giraffe behavior in the wild have noted that these intelligent animals have learned to compensate for the tree's warning system. Giraffes typically feed while moving upwind or crosswind, avoiding the trees that would have received the ethylene warning from the tree they just left. It's a fascinating example of evolutionary adaptation and counter-adaptation, a game of chemical strategy played out across generations. Similar VOC-based warning systems have been discovered in many other tree species. When elm trees or pine trees are attacked by leaf-eating caterpillars, they release specific blends of volatile compounds that have multiple effects. First, the compounds directly repel some insect species, making the tree less attractive as a food source. Second, the compounds can attract predators or parasites of the herbivores. Pine trees under caterpillar attack release VOCs that attract parasitic wasps. These wasps don't harm the tree, but they do lay their eggs in the caterpillars. And when the wasp larvae hatch, they consume the caterpillars from the inside. The tree, in effect, calls in reinforcements, using chemical signals to recruit allies in its battle against herbivores. VOC communication can be remarkably specific. Different types of damage produce different chemical signatures. The blend of compounds released during an insect attack differs from the blend released during drought stress or disease. This specificity allows receiving trees to tailor their responses appropriately. A tree detecting insect attack, VOCs, might activate pathways that produce defensive compounds and prepare for battle. A tree detecting drought stress VOCs might close its stomata to conserve water and begin producing stress protection proteins. The timing and concentration of VOC release is also carefully regulated. Plants produce more VOCs during the day than at night, with peak production often occurring in late morning or early afternoon, when temperatures are warm and insect activity is high. The chemical composition of forest air changes throughout the day as different species release different compounds in response to varying conditions. Some compounds are produced continuously at low levels as a kind of background defense. Others are released in bursts when the tree detects a threat. Not all VOC communication is defensive. Some volatile compounds facilitate cooperation between species. In forests where conifers like Douglas fir grow alongside deciduous trees like aspen and birch, the different species use overlapping mycorrhizal networks to share resources underground, and they also communicate through airborne chemicals. When one species experiences stress, the VOCs it releases can prime the defense systems of neighboring trees of different species, creating a kind of community resistance. The scientific study of tree VOCs has revealed layer after layer of complexity. Researchers have found that the response of a tree to VOCs isn't just a simple on-off switch. It's more like priming, where the tree that receives a warning signal doesn't immediately produce full defense, but rather prepares its systems so it can respond more quickly and effectively if it does get attacked. This priming can involve epigenetic changes, modifications to how genes are expressed that can persist for weeks or even months after the initial signal. There's also evidence that VOC communication has an intergenerational component. A tree that experiences stress and activates its defenses may produce seeds that germinate into seedlings with enhanced defensive capabilities, as if the mother tree has passed on a warning to her offspring through her seeds. This kind of transgenerational plasticity suggests that trees can, in a sense, learn from experience and transmit that knowledge to future generations, not through any conscious process, but through chemical and genetic mechanisms. The atmosphere of a forest is constantly alive with these chemical conversations. Terpenes, alcohols, aldehydes, and hundreds of other compounds drift through the air, each carrying information, each potentially altering the behavior of organisms that detect them. And it's not just trees that respond to these signals. Fungi, bacteria, insects, and even animals can detect and respond to plant VOCs. The chemical messages create a web of interactions that links all members of the forest community. For humans, these volatile compounds have effects too. When we walk in a forest and breathe in the forest air, we're inhaling a complex cocktail of plant VOCs, particularly compounds called phytoncides. These natural chemicals, produced by trees to protect themselves from disease, have measurable effects on human physiology and psychology. Studies have shown that exposure to forest VOCs can boost our immune system, reduce stress hormones like cortisol, lower blood pressure, and improve mood. The practice of forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku, developed in Japan, explicitly seeks to harness these health benefits by encouraging people to spend time immersed in forest atmospheres, breathing deeply and mindfully. The chemical language of trees is a language we're only beginning to translate. Each compound, each blend, each ratio of one substance to another can convey different information. Some messages are meant for other trees of the same species. Some are intended for different species. Some are calls for help directed at predators of herbivores. Some are simply side effects of metabolic processes, chemical byproducts with no communicative function at all. Sorting out which is which, understanding the grammar and syntax of this chemical language, represents one of the great challenges of modern plant science. What's becoming clear, though, is that the image of trees as passive, isolated organisms is fundamentally wrong. Trees are constantly sensing their environment, detecting threats, assessing opportunities, and responding by producing and releasing chemical signals. They are, in a very real sense, talking to one another and to the entire forest community. And this chemical conversation, invisible to our eyes but detectable by sensitive instruments, never stops. Day and night, season after season, the air above every forest carries messages, warnings, invitations, and commands, written in a language of molecules that has evolved over millions of years to orchestrate the life of the woods. Electrical signals, the tree nervous system. If you were to cut into a tree, to slice through its bark and into the living tissue beneath, you would trigger an immediate response. Within seconds, electrical signals would pulse through the tree's body, racing from the site of injury to distant branches and roots. These aren't metaphorical signals. They're real, measurable electrical impulses, strikingly similar, in some ways, to the nerve signals that travel through animal nervous systems. Plants, of course, don't have nerves. They lack the neurons, synapses, and neural networks that characterize animal nervous systems. But they do have their own form of electrical communication. And scientists are discovering that this system is far more sophisticated than anyone previously imagined. The story of electrical signaling in plants goes back more than a century. In the late 1800s, scientists including Charles Darwin observed that certain plants, like the sensitive Mimosa pudica, could respond remarkably quickly to touch, folding their leaves within seconds. Even the carnivorous Venus flytrap snaps shut in less than a second when trigger hairs inside the trap are touched twice in quick succession. Such rapid responses couldn't be explained by slow chemical signaling or hormonal communication. Something faster was clearly at work. Modern research has confirmed that plants generate electrical signals in response to various stimuli. When a tree is wounded, touched, exposed to sudden cold or heat, subjected to drought, or attacked by insects, ions begin to flow across cell membranes in characteristic patterns, creating waves of electrical potential that propagate through the plant's tissues. These signals travel through the vascular system, the xylem and phloem that normally transport water, minerals, and sugars, as well as through other cell types. Scientists have identified several distinct types of electrical signals in plants. Action potentials in plants are rapid, all-or-nothing electrical events, similar to the action potentials in animal neurons. They propagate at speeds ranging from about 1 centimeter per second up to several centimeters per second, much slower than animal nerve impulses, which can travel at over 100 meters per second, but still fast enough to transmit information throughout a tree in minutes rather than hours or days. Variation potentials are slower, more variable electrical responses that typically occur in response to damage or sudden environmental stress. These signals can trigger a cascade of physiological responses, including changes in photosynthesis, respiration, and gene expression. System potentials, a more recently described type of electrical signal, travel through plants' root systems and may play roles in coordinating responses across the whole plant. One of the leading researchers in plant electrical signaling is Dr. Edward Farmer at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. His work has helped to elucidate how plants use electrical signals to coordinate defense responses. When a leaf is chewed by an insect, the damage triggers electrical signals that race through the plant, activating defensive gene expression in leaves that haven't yet been touched. This allows the plant to prepare its defenses before the insect reaches those leaves, essentially mounting a preemptive strike. But how do plants generate these electrical signals without neurons? The answer lies in their cell membranes and the proteins embedded within them. Plant cell membranes, like animal cell membranes, maintain differences in ion concentrations between the inside and outside of the cell. Typically, the inside of a plant cell is slightly negative compared to the outside, creating what's called a resting potential. When a stimulus occurs, certain membrane proteins called ion channels open, allowing ions, particularly calcium, potassium, and chloride ions, to flow across the membrane. This ion flow changes the electrical potential of the cell, depolarizing it. If the depolarization is strong enough, it can trigger adjacent cells to depolarize as well, creating a wave of electrical activity that propagates through the tissue. It's conceptually similar to the action potential in neurons, though the specific mechanisms and the speeds involved are quite different. Calcium ions appear to play a particularly important role in plant electrical signaling. Changes in calcium concentration inside cells act as a kind of universal signal that can trigger a wide variety of responses. Researchers have observed calcium waves spreading through plants following electrical stimulation, suggesting that electrical signals and calcium signaling are intimately linked. In trees, electrical signals can travel remarkable distances. Researchers studying avocado trees have continuously monitored electrical potentials in the trunks, inserting electrodes into the sapwood and recording the voltage differences over time. They've observed systematic patterns of electrical activity that correlate with light-dark cycles, water availability, and stress conditions. When the trees transition from light to darkness, consistent changes in electrical potential occur. When the soil dries out and the trees begin to experience water stress, characteristic electrical signals appear well before any visual symptoms of drought stress become apparent. This has led some researchers to propose that electrical signals could be used as early warning systems, biological sensors that could alert farmers or foresters to stress conditions before they become severe. Imagine a forest where trees are instrumented with electrodes, continuously monitoring the electrical chatter, looking for the signatures of drought, disease, or insect attack. Such systems could potentially revolutionize forest management, allowing interventions before problems become critical. But electrical signaling in trees isn't just about responding to danger. It's also involved in coordinating normal growth and development. The process of photosynthesis, the transport of nutrients through the vascular system, the opening and closing of stomata to regulate gas exchange and water loss. All of these processes involve ion movements and electrical potentials. Some researchers argue that the entire physiology of a tree is orchestrated through electrical signals, a kind of botanical nervous system that integrates information from all parts of the plant and coordinates appropriate responses. There's even evidence that electrical signals can travel between plants, not just within a single plant. In experiments where researchers have connected the soil around different plants with metal wires, they've found that electrically stimulating one plant can trigger electrical responses in nearby plants, even plants of different species. The soil itself acts as an electrical conductor, and signals can propagate through the soil from root to root, creating yet another channel for plant-to-plant communication. This electrical communication through soil has only recently been documented, and scientists are still working to understand how common and how important it might be in natural ecosystems. It adds another layer of complexity to the already intricate web of communication pathways that link plants together. Along with mycorrhizal networks, volatile organic compounds, and direct root grafting, electrical signaling through the soil represents a fourth major route for trees to share information. Monica Galliano, a researcher at the University of Western Australia, has taken the study of plant communication in an even more radical direction. Her work suggests that plants might also use sound as a form of communication. She's gathered evidence that some plants can emit sounds, particularly from their roots, at frequencies around 220 Hz, too low for human ears to detect without special equipment. Even more intriguingly, she's found evidence that plant roots grow toward the sound of running water, and that some flowering plants increase nectar production in response to the sound frequencies of bee-wing beats. If true, this would add acoustic communication to the repertoire of plant signaling methods. The mechanisms remain unclear, and this research remains controversial, with many scientists calling for additional studies to confirm these surprising findings. But it hints at the possibility that plants might be using channels of communication that we've never even considered. The electrical activity in trees also raises profound questions about plant cognition and intelligence. When we observe electrical signals racing through a tree in response to damage, signals that trigger defensive responses in distant parts of the tree, it's tempting to draw parallels to neural processing in animals. Some researchers have even begun to speak of plant neurobiology, or plant intelligence, terms that many other scientists find objectionable. Critics argue that plants don't have brains, don't have consciousness, and therefore can't be said to think or to be intelligent in any meaningful sense. The electrical signals in plants, they contend, are simply reflexive responses, biochemical reactions that happen automatically without any decision-making or awareness. To call this intelligence, they say, is anthropomorphism, projecting human-like qualities onto organisms that are fundamentally different. Proponents counter that intelligence doesn't require a brain. They point out that intelligence can be defined as the ability to solve problems, to integrate information from multiple sources, and to produce adaptive responses, all of which plants clearly do. The architecture of root systems, with their branching patterns and ability to explore soil, has been compared to the architecture of neural networks. The decision-making processes that plants employ, choosing which direction to grow, how much to invest in roots versus shoots, when to flower, when to defend, all of these represent forms of information processing and optimization that, at a functional level, resemble intelligence. This debate remains unresolved, and perhaps ultimately comes down to how we choose to define terms like intelligence and cognition. What's not in doubt is that trees have sophisticated signaling systems, including electrical signaling, that allow them to sense their environment, process information, and coordinate complex responses. Whether we choose to call that intelligence or simply reflexive biochemistry may be more a matter of philosophy than science. For a tree, electrical signaling provides speed. Chemical signals traveling through the xylem or phloem might take hours to reach from roots to crown. Hormones diffusing from cell to cell could take even longer. But an electrical signal can traverse a tree in minutes, allowing rapid responses to sudden threats. When combined with the mycorrhizal network's ability to transmit signals between trees and the atmospheric transmission of volatile compounds, trees have access to a multi-channel communication system that operates across multiple timescales and spatial scales, from the instantaneous to the gradual, from centimeters to kilometers. As you sit beneath a tree, nothing seems to be happening. The trunk is still, the bark solid and silent. But if you could somehow listen to the electrical whispers traveling through that wood, you'd hear a constant murmur of activity, signals flowing up from roots that have detected moisture in the soil, signals flowing down from leaves that have sensed a shadow passing overhead, signals crossing from one side of the trunk to the other, integrating information, coordinating the growth of branches to balance the crown. The tree is alive with electrical communication, a nervous system without nerves, processing information and responding to the world with a sophistication that we're only beginning to appreciate. Mother trees and resource sharing. In every forest, there are elders. These are the oldest, tallest trees, the ones that tower above the canopy, their crowns reaching toward open sky, while their roots delve deep into the earth. For years, foresters valued these trees primarily for their timber, viewing them as mature assets to be harvested. But research over the past few decades has revealed that these ancient giants play a role far more important than anyone suspected. They are the mother trees, the hubs and anchors of the forest's communication network, and their removal can destabilize entire ecosystems. Suzanne Simard, the ecologist whose work on mycorrhizal networks we've already discussed, was the first to systematically study these hub trees and coin the term mother tree. The name is apt, not because these trees are necessarily female, but because they exhibit behaviors that seem remarkably maternal, nurturing younger trees and supporting the growth of future generations. Mother trees are defined by several characteristics. They are typically the largest and oldest trees in a forest stand, often exceeding 200, 300, or even 500 years of age in species like Douglas fir, giant sequoia, or various oaks. Because they've been growing for so long, they have the most extensive root systems, both in terms of depth and lateral spread. These roots access water and nutrients from soil layers that younger, smaller trees cannot reach. And because they're tall and have full access to sunlight, mother trees can photosynthesize efficiently and produce far more sugars than they need for their own metabolism. But here's the crucial discovery. Mother trees don't hoard their excess resources. They share them. Through their connections to mycorrhizal networks, mother trees pump substantial amounts of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water into the fungal filaments that link them to surrounding trees, especially to seedlings and saplings growing in the shaded understory. Think about the challenge facing a young tree seedling in a mature forest. The canopy far above blocks most of the sunlight. The seedling might receive only 2 to 5% of full sunlight, barely enough to support basic photosynthesis. At such low light levels, the seedling can photosynthesize, but it produces only just enough sugars to keep itself alive. It cannot accumulate reserves. It cannot grow quickly. In many cases, it cannot survive at all without outside help. This is where the mother tree's role becomes critical. By transferring carbon and other nutrients through the mycorrhizal network to these struggling seedlings, mother trees provide a lifeline, a subsidy that allows the young trees to survive in conditions where they would otherwise starve. Studies have shown that seedlings connected to mother trees through fungal networks have significantly higher survival rates, grow taller and faster, and develop better nutrition than seedlings that lack these connections or that are isolated from the network. The amount of resource transfer can be substantial. Researchers using radioactive isotopes to trace carbon movement have found that a single mother tree might transfer enough carbon to support dozens of seedlings simultaneously. In some experiments, the carbon received by seedlings from larger trees was equivalent to the amount the seedlings would have produced through photosynthesis if they had been growing in full sunlight. In other words, mother trees can essentially double the resources available to their offspring. And yes, mother trees do appear to recognize and favor their own genetic offspring. This was one of the most surprising findings from Simard's research. In experiments where seedlings of known parentage were planted in forests and allowed to connect to mycorrhizal networks, the seedlings that were genetic offspring of nearby large trees received more carbon than genetically unrelated seedlings. Somehow, the mother tree could distinguish her own children from strangers and preferentially direct resources to her own kin. The mechanism for this kin recognition remains mysterious. Plant roots don't have sensory organs in any conventional sense. They don't have eyes or noses, yet they clearly can detect chemical signals, and different genotypes of the same species produce slightly different chemical signatures. It's possible that mother trees recognize their offspring by detecting these chemical fingerprints in root exudates or in signals carried through the mycorrhizal network. But the details of how this recognition works at the cellular and molecular level are still being investigated. This kin recognition has profound evolutionary implications. It suggests that natural selection operates not just on individual trees, but on family groups. A tree that invests resources in its own genetic offspring is, in an evolutionary sense, investing in copies of its own genes. The offspring that survive because of this help will carry the mother tree's genetic legacy forward. In this way, resource sharing through mycorrhizal networks could be favored by natural selection, not as pure altruism, but as a form of kin selection, similar to parental care in animals. But mother trees don't only support their own offspring. They also share resources with unrelated seedlings of the same species, and even, in some cases, with seedlings of different species. In mixed species forests, researchers have documented carbon transfer between conifers and deciduous trees, between Douglas firs and aspens, between spruces and birches. This broader form of resource sharing might seem harder to explain from an evolutionary perspective. Why would a tree help a competitor, especially a competitor of a different species? Several possible explanations exist. One is that the sharing is mediated primarily by the fungi, which have their own evolutionary interests. From the fungus's perspective, keeping all connected trees alive and healthy ensures a continued supply of sugars. So, the fungus might actively redistribute resources in ways that benefit the network as a whole, even if individual trees would benefit more from being selfish. Another possibility is that supporting the forest community benefits individual trees indirectly. A diverse, healthy forest with multiple species and multiple age classes is more resilient to disturbances like storms, fires, diseases, and insect outbreaks. Trees that contribute to this community resilience are, in the long run, more likely to survive and reproduce than trees in degraded, species-poor forests. The resource sharing, in this view, is a form of ecosystem engineering that creates conditions favorable to the donor tree's own long-term success. There's also evidence that mother trees become more generous as they age, particularly as they approach death. In experiments where researchers have injured or stressed large trees to simulate the beginning of decline, they've observed that these trees dramatically increase their transfer of carbon into the mycorrhizal network. It's as if the dying tree is distributing its assets, passing on its accumulated resources to the next generation before it's too late. This phenomenon has been observed most clearly in studies of Douglas fir. When a mature Douglas fir is injured severely enough to signal that it won't survive, it dumps its reserves of carbohydrates into the network. Nearby seedlings, connected to the network, receive this windfall. But the transfer doesn't just involve carbon. The dying tree also sends signals that upregulate defensive enzymes in the surviving trees, priming them to resist insects and diseases. It's a form of transgenerational communication, where the older tree shares both resources and warnings, preparing the younger generation for the challenges they'll face. The significance of mother trees extends beyond just resource transfer. Their extensive root systems also provide physical structure to the soil, helping to prevent erosion. Their deep roots can tap into underground water sources during droughts, bringing water up to shallow soil layers where it becomes available to smaller plants. Their large crowns intercept precipitation, and the water that drips from their leaves and flows down their trunks helps to distribute moisture more evenly across the forest floor. Mother trees also serve as repositories of genetic diversity. Ancient trees that have survived for centuries have weathered countless storms, droughts, fires, and pest outbreaks. Their genes encode successful strategies for surviving these challenges. When these trees reproduce, they pass on genes that have been tested by time. The seeds of mother trees often exhibit higher germination rates and greater stress tolerance than seeds from younger trees. Furthermore, the trunks and branches of old trees provide habitat for countless species. The bark fissures house insects, spiders, and other arthropods. Cavities in the wood shelter birds, mammals, and fungi. The crowns support lichens, mosses, and epiphytic plants. When you remove a mother tree from a forest, you're not just removing one organism. You're removing an entire condominium complex, home to dozens or hundreds of other species. All of this explains why scientists like Suzanne Simard have become vocal advocates for changing forest management practices. Traditional forestry has often focused on clear-cutting, removing all the trees from an area, and then replanting with young trees of commercially valuable species. But this practice eliminates the mother trees, severs the mycorrhizal networks, and removes the biological legacy that helps regeneration succeed. Simard and others argue for retention forestry, a practice where some of the oldest, largest trees are left standing even during harvest operations. By preserving mother trees and maintaining network connectivity, forests can regenerate more quickly, with higher survival rates for seedlings and greater resilience to stress. The mother trees continue to nurture the young forest, providing resources and information that help the next generation establish itself. There's economic value in this approach too. Forests that regenerate successfully require less replanting, less fertilization, and less protection from pests. The ecosystem services they provide, including carbon sequestration, water filtration, and biodiversity habitat, are more robust. And over the long term, forests managed to preserve network integrity may actually produce more timber than forests that are clear-cut and replanted because the surviving trees grow faster and healthier. The concept of mother trees has resonated deeply with the public, perhaps because it provides a compelling metaphor for thinking about forests differently. Instead of viewing trees as isolated individuals competing for resources, we can see them as members of families and communities, supporting one another, sharing their wealth, and investing in future generations. It's a vision of the forest as a caring, cooperative place. And while we must be cautious about anthropomorphizing trees, the science does support the idea that trees, in their own way, nurture their young and build legacies that outlast their individual lives. As climate change increases stress on forests worldwide, the role of mother trees may become even more important. These ancient trees have survived past climate fluctuations and have adapted to changing conditions. Their offspring, inheriting their genes and benefiting from their support, may be better equipped to handle the warmer, drier, more unpredictable conditions of the future. Preserving mother trees isn't just about respecting the past. It's about investing in the future, ensuring that forests have the best possible chance to adapt and endure through whatever challenges lie ahead. Defense systems and warning networks. Every forest is a battleground. Insects chew on leaves, fungi invade tissues, bacteria colonize wounds, larger herbivores strip bark, and countless microscopic threats probe every surface looking for a way in. Trees, rooted in place, and unable to flee, must defend themselves against this constant assault. And they do so with a chemical arsenal that would make a pharmacy jealous, compounds that poison, deter, confuse, and sometimes even recruit allies to fight their battles for them. But defense is expensive. Producing toxic compounds requires energy and resources that could otherwise go toward growth or reproduction. A tree that invested all its resources in defense might be safe from pests, but would grow so slowly it would be outcompeted by its neighbors. A tree that invested nothing in defense would grow quickly, but would be devoured by insects. The challenge, then, is to deploy defenses strategically, to ramp them up when needed and dial them down when the coast is clear. This is where communication comes in. By sharing information about threats through mycorrhizal networks, volatile organic compounds, and other signaling pathways, trees can coordinate their defenses, responding collectively to dangers and warning one another before attacks spread. The system works something like this. When a tree is attacked by insects, the damage triggers a cascade of responses. Damaged cells release signals, often including compounds derived from cell membranes that are broken during chewing. These signals activate defense genes, starting the production of compounds that make the tree less appealing or more toxic to herbivores. Common defensive chemicals include tannins, which bind to proteins and interfere with digestion, making leaves taste terrible and providing little nutrition even when eaten. Phenolic compounds can be toxic to many insects and fungi. Alkaloids, nitrogen-containing compounds, can be potent neurotoxins or digestive inhibitors. Terpenoids can repel insects or attract their predators. But producing these compounds takes time, often hours or days. By the time the damaged tree has fully activated its defenses, the insect responsible might have moved on to a neighboring tree. This is where the warning system becomes crucial. The attacked tree doesn't just defend itself. It sends out alarm signals to its neighbors. We've already discussed how acacia trees use ethylene gas to warn neighbors about giraffe browsing. But the system is even more sophisticated in many other species. Consider what happens when a mountain pine beetle attacks a pine tree. The beetle burrows through the bark, creating a wound that triggers resin production. The tree attempts to seal the wound and entomb the beetle in sticky resin. But if the attack is heavy, if many beetles are boring into the tree simultaneously, the tree's resin defenses may be overwhelmed. As the beetles tunnel into the wood, the tree releases a complex blend of volatile organic compounds, including terpenes and greenleaf volatiles. These compounds serve multiple functions. They're directly toxic or repellent to some insects, providing immediate local defense. They also travel through the air to nearby trees. When neighboring trees detect these attack-associated VOCs, they preemptively activate their own defense systems, producing more resin, fortifying their tissues, and making themselves less vulnerable before the beetles ever reach them. Research on European pine trees has shown that trees exposed to VOCs from beetle-attacked neighbors respond within hours by increasing production of defensive compounds. And this priming can persist for weeks. A tree that has been warned remains on high alert, ready to respond quickly if it is attacked. The result is that outbreaks of bark beetles, while devastating, often spread more slowly than they would if trees couldn't communicate, because trees on the perimeter of the outbreak are preparing their defenses in advance. The warning signals can also travel underground through mycorrhizal networks. When a tree is attacked, and begins producing defensive compounds. Some of those compounds, or their precursors, can be transmitted through the fungal network to neighboring trees. Studies using radioactive tracers have shown that jasmonic acid, a plant hormone central to wound response and defense activation, can move from plant to plant via mycorrhizal connections. Trees receiving these chemical warnings through the network respond by upregulating their own defenses. The two-channel system, airborne VOCs and underground mycorrhizal transmission, provides redundancy and speed. Volatile signals travel quickly, potentially alerting trees across the forest within minutes to hours. But they're vulnerable to wind patterns, dissipating and diluting with distance. Underground signals may travel more slowly, but they're more direct, following the physical connections of the network, and they can carry more complex information. Not just a simple warning, but specific details about the type of threat. Interestingly, trees can sometimes distinguish between different types of threats based on the specific patterns of damage and the chemical signatures of the attacker. Chewing by caterpillars produces a different chemical signature than sucking by aphids, which differs from fungal infection. The signals released reflect these differences, and receiving trees can respond with defenses tailored to the specific threat. Some trees also employ a clever indirect defense strategy. They recruit bodyguards. When certain plants and trees are attacked by herbivorous insects, they release VOCs that attract predators or parasitoids of those herbivores. The VOCs act as a distress call that says, essentially, free meal here. Predatory insects, parasitic wasps, and other carnivorous arthropods are attracted to these signals and arrive to find a buffet of herbivores conveniently gathered on the calling tree. The predators reduce the herbivore population, which benefits the tree, even though the tree doesn't directly harm the herbivores itself. This tritrophic interaction, involving the plant, the herbivore, and the predator, can become quite complex. Some herbivorous insects have evolved to avoid plants that produce the calling VOCs, or to feed more cautiously to reduce the signals they trigger. Some predators have evolved to specialize on particular VOC blends, becoming highly efficient at finding specific prey. The entire system represents an evolutionary arms race played out in chemical signals. Defense communication isn't always cooperative, though. Trees also use chemical signals to compete. Some species produce allelopathic compounds, chemicals that they release into the soil through their roots, or that leach from their leaves in rain. These compounds can inhibit the germination or growth of other plants, including the seedlings of competing species. In a dense forest where every tree is vying for light, water, and nutrients, chemical warfare can be just as important as direct physical competition. Black walnut trees are famous for this. They produce a compound called juglone, which is toxic to many other plant species. The compound accumulates in the soil around the walnut tree, creating a zone where few other plants can survive. This reduces competition and benefits the walnut tree, though it also makes the ground beneath a walnut tree rather barren, compared to the lush undergrowth beneath other tree species. In this case, communication is less about cooperation and more about dominance. Chemical messaging that says "stay away" rather than "watch out." Recent research has also begun to explore how trees might use their communication networks, not just to warn about current threats, but to prepare for future challenges. This involves a concept called priming or induced resistance, where exposure to a mild stress, or to signals from stressed neighbors doesn't immediately activate full defenses, but instead prepares the plant's systems to respond more rapidly and robustly if and when a real attack occurs. It's analogous to a military force going on alert, not deploying all its resources yet, but positioning them for quick deployment if needed. This priming can involve epigenetic changes, modifications to DNA that don't alter the genetic sequence, but do change which genes are expressed. A tree that has been primed might have certain defense-related genes tagged with chemical marks that make them easier to activate quickly. When a subsequent attack occurs, these genes can be switched on almost immediately, much faster than if the tree had to start from scratch. The priming can sometimes persist for weeks, months, or even across growing seasons, providing a kind of immunological memory. There's even evidence that stress experienced by parent trees can affect the phenotype of their offspring. Seeds produced by a tree that has experienced repeated insect attack may germinate into seedlings with enhanced defensive traits, higher baseline levels of defensive compounds, or more sensitive alarm systems. This transgenerational plasticity allows trees to pass on information about environmental threats to their offspring, giving the seedlings a head start in a dangerous world. It's not genetic evolution, which would take many generations, but rather a within-lifetime adjustment that can be transmitted through seeds. All of these defense communication systems have important implications for forest health and management. Forests where communication networks are intact, where mother trees and their associated mycorrhizal networks connect the trees, tend to be more resistant to pest outbreaks and disease epidemics. The trees can warn one another, coordinate responses, and support individuals under attack. In contrast, plantations where trees are planted in rows, with limited mycorrhizal diversity and no old trees to serve as hubs, often suffer more severe damage from pests because the warning systems and support networks have been disrupted. Understanding tree defense communication also opens possibilities for more sustainable pest management. If we can identify the key signaling compounds that activate defenses, we might be able to apply synthetic versions to trees, priming them to resist attack without resorting to toxic pesticides. Or we could manage forests to maximize network connectivity, ensuring that warning signals can spread quickly through the population. Some researchers are even exploring the idea of using one plant species to protect another by exploiting cross-species warning signals in mixed plantings. The chemical language of defense is written in molecules too small to see and scents too faint for human noses to detect. But it's a language that trees speak fluently. In every moment, in every forest, trees are broadcasting information about threats, listening for warnings from neighbors, and adjusting their defenses accordingly. It's a constant conversation about survival, a sharing of intelligence that helps the forest as a whole resist the countless organisms that would consume it. And it's a reminder that even organisms without brains can exhibit collective behaviors that look remarkably like intelligence when viewed at the right scale. Natural root grafting. There's another form of tree communication that operates on a much more direct, physical level: natural root grafting. This is the phenomenon where the roots of two trees, growing close together in the soil, literally fuse, joining their vascular systems and creating a living bridge through which water, nutrients, and even large molecules can flow directly from one tree to another. Root grafting happens naturally in many species. When the roots of two trees come into contact underground and remain pressed together, the constant pressure and abrasion gradually wear away the bark on the touching surfaces. Eventually, the cambium layer of the two roots, the thin layer of actively dividing cells that generates new wood and bark, makes contact. When the cambium cells of two trees touch, something remarkable happens. They can fuse, the cells recognizing one another as compatible and growing together to form a continuous tissue. The process takes time, often months or years, but once a graft union is complete, it creates a direct vascular connection. The xylem, which carries water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, and the phloem, which carries sugars from the leaves to the roots, become continuous between the two trees. In effect, the two trees are no longer entirely separate individuals. They share a circulatory system. Root grafting is surprisingly common. In some forests, studies have found that up to 75% of trees are naturally grafted to at least one neighbor, and many are grafted to multiple neighbors. The closer trees are planted, the more likely grafting is to occur. In dense natural forests, where trees have been growing together for centuries, extensive networks of grafted roots can develop, creating underground webs of direct physical connection. Most often, root grafting occurs between trees of the same species. This makes sense, because the cambium cells of closely related trees are more likely to recognize each other as compatible. Grafts between different species of the same genus can sometimes occur, and very rarely, grafts between trees of different genera have been reported, though these are exceptional cases. The rule of thumb is that the closer the genetic relationship, the more likely a successful graft. What benefit does root grafting provide? For trees growing in difficult conditions, the ability to share resources directly can be critical for survival. Imagine a forest on a slope where water availability varies dramatically with elevation. Trees on the drier upper slope might struggle during droughts, while trees lower down have better access to groundwater. If the roots are grafted, water can flow from the trees that have plenty to the trees that are stressed, helping the entire grafted network survive conditions that might kill isolated trees. Similarly, nutrients can be shared through grafted roots. If one tree is growing in a nutrient-rich patch of soil, while a neighbor is in poorer soil, nutrients can flow through the graft to equalize the distribution. Carbohydrates produced through photosynthesis can also move between grafted trees. A tree growing in full sunlight can support a grafted neighbor that's shaded, much like the resource sharing that occurs through mycorrhizal networks, but through a direct plumbing connection rather than through fungal intermediaries. This resource sharing can dramatically affect tree survival. Researchers studying lodgepole pine forests found that trees in grafted pairs or groups had higher survival rates during droughts than isolated trees. The grafted trees buffered each other against stress, the ones with better access to water or deeper roots supporting those with shallower roots or less favorable positions. Root grafting can also have interesting consequences when one tree in a grafted pair dies or is cut down. You might expect that when a tree is cut, its root system would die, deprived of the sugars that the leaves produce through photosynthesis. But if the roots are grafted to a living tree, those roots can remain alive, sustained by sugars flowing through the graft from the living tree's leaves. The stump of the cut tree stays living, and sometimes it even continues to produce new shoots, supported entirely by its grafted neighbor. This phenomenon, where a tree stump remains alive long after the tree has been felled, has been observed in many forests around the world. In European beech forests, for example, stumps that are hundreds of years old have been found still living, still green with chlorophyll beneath the bark, sustained by grafted connections to surrounding trees. To a casual observer, it looks like an old dead stump, but scrape the surface and you'll find living tissue. Why would a living tree support the root system of a cut stump? It seems counterintuitive, but there are several possible explanations. One is that the graft is so complete that the living tree cannot distinguish the grafted roots as separate from its own roots. The two root systems have become functionally one, and the living tree continues to send sugars to all parts of this combined system, including the roots that once belonged to the cut tree. Another possibility is that keeping the grafted roots alive benefits the living tree. Those roots, even without a crown, can still absorb water and nutrients from the soil. They can still anchor the soil and prevent erosion. If the living tree is benefiting from these services, it makes economic sense to continue supporting the grafted roots. There's also a kin selection argument. If the grafted trees are closely related, perhaps siblings grown from seeds that fell from the same parent tree, then supporting each other, even after one has lost its crown, could be favored by natural selection because it increases the survival of shared genes. Whatever the reason, these living stumps are a vivid demonstration of just how connected trees can be. They show that the boundary between individual trees is often blurry, that what we perceive as separate organisms may actually be parts of a larger grafted system. Root grafting doesn't always have positive effects, though. Grafts can also transmit diseases. If one tree in a grafted network becomes infected with a pathogen that spreads through the vascular system, the disease can travel through root grafts to all the connected trees. Dutch elm disease, which devastated American elm populations in the 20th century, spreads in part through root grafts. A beetle carries fungal spores from tree to tree, and once one tree is infected, the fungus spreads through the tree's vascular system and then continues into the roots of grafted neighbors. An entire stand of elms can be connected through grafts, allowing the disease to race through the population much faster than it could if the trees were isolated. Oak wilt, a devastating disease caused by a fungal pathogen, also spreads through root grafts in oak stands. Land managers have had to develop techniques to sever root grafts, using trenching machines to cut through the soil and break the underground connections, in order to create fire breaks, or, more accurately, disease breaks, to prevent infected stands from spreading the disease to healthy stands. So root grafting represents a double-edged sword for trees. It provides benefits in terms of resource sharing and mutual support, but it also creates vulnerabilities, pathways for diseases to spread. From an evolutionary perspective, the benefits must outweigh the costs in most situations, or else the phenomenon wouldn't be so common. But it's a reminder that interconnection always comes with trade-offs. The study of root grafting has also raised interesting questions about tree identity and individuality. If two trees are grafted together, sharing a vascular system, exchanging resources and information continuously, in what sense are they still two trees? Some philosophers and scientists have argued that we should think of grafted forest stands as superorganisms, single entities composed of multiple physically distinct but functionally unified parts. This perspective challenges our intuitive understanding of what an organism is. We're used to thinking of organisms as bounded entities with clear edges. An animal has skin, a bacterium has a cell membrane, but trees, with their mycorrhizal networks and root grafts and shared resource pools, don't fit neatly into this framework. The boundaries are porous, the connections are many, and the distinction between self and other becomes less clear. In forestry practice, understanding root grafting has practical implications. When planning thinning operations, where some trees are removed to reduce competition and allow remaining trees to grow larger, foresters need to consider root grafts. If you cut down half the trees in a stand without recognizing that they're grafted to the trees you want to keep, you might accidentally create a situation where the remaining trees are trying to support the root systems of all the cut trees, draining resources that would otherwise go into growth. On the other hand, in restoration projects, where the goal is to establish new forest on degraded land, understanding root grafting suggests strategies. Planting trees close together, even if you plan to thin them later, might help them establish by allowing grafts to form, creating a support network that boosts survival during the vulnerable early years. Some arborists and landscape architects have even intentionally created grafts between tree branches or roots for artistic or structural purposes, a practice called tree shaping. By carefully manipulating growing trees, tying branches together, and encouraging them to fuse, it's possible to create living sculptures, bridges, and architectural forms. This technique exploits the same biological capacity for fusion that underlies natural root grafting, but directs it toward human purposes. The phenomenon of root grafting adds yet another layer to our understanding of tree communication. Along with mycorrhizal networks, volatile organic compounds, and electrical signals, direct root grafts represent a fourth major pathway for trees to connect with one another. Each pathway has different properties, different speeds, different ranges, different types of information that can be transmitted. Together, they create a redundant, robust communication system that allows trees to coordinate their behavior and support one another in ways that enhance the survival of the forest as a whole. When you walk through a forest and look at the trees standing separate and distinct, remember that beneath your feet, their roots may be intertwined, their vascular systems merged, their fates linked in ways invisible to the eye. The forest is not a collection of individuals, but a community, a network, a living system, where the parts are constantly communicating, sharing, and cooperating. The health benefits, phytoncides, and forest bathing. There's a reason walking in a forest feels so good. Beyond the beauty, beyond the quiet, beyond the simple pleasure of being surrounded by green, there's a physiological response happening in your body when you breathe forest air. Trees, as they defend themselves against disease and pests, release antimicrobial compounds into the atmosphere. And when you inhale these compounds, your body responds in measurable, beneficial ways. These compounds are called phytoncides, from the Greek words for plant and exterminate, reflecting their original function. They exterminate or inhibit the bacteria, fungi, and insects that threaten trees. But they also have powerful effects on human health. The science of phytoncides and their health effects began to be seriously studied in the 1980s in Japan, where the practice of shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, was developed as a form of preventive healthcare. The concept is simple. Spend time in forests, Immerse yourself in the forest atmosphere, breathe deeply, and engage all your senses with the natural environment. It's not about hiking or exercising, though those activities have their own benefits. It's about simply being present in the forest, allowing the forest to work its effects on your body and mind. Dr. Qing Li, a physician and researcher at Nippon Medical School in Tokyo, has been one of the leading scientists studying the physiological effects of forest bathing. His research has documented a range of health benefits that occur when people spend time in forests, many of which appear to be mediated by phytoncides. The most dramatic findings involve the immune system. Li and his colleagues measured the activity of natural killer cells, a type of white blood cell that plays a critical role in the body's defense against viral infections and cancer. Natural killer cells, or NK cells, circulate through the bloodstream, seeking out virus-infected cells and tumor cells and destroying them. They're part of the innate immune system, providing a first line of defense before the slower, more specific, adaptive immune response kicks in. In experiments where participants spent time walking in forests, Li found that NK cell activity increased significantly, often by more than 50%, compared to baseline levels measured before the forest visits. Even more remarkably, this boost in NK cell activity wasn't temporary. It persisted for up to 30 days after a single forest bathing trip. People who spent a weekend in the forest showed elevated NK cell activity for a full month afterward. The increase wasn't just in the activity of the cells, but also in their numbers. After forest bathing, people had more NK cells circulating in their bloodstreams, and those cells contained higher levels of anti-cancer proteins, like perforin, granulysin, and granzymes, molecules that NK cells use to kill infected or cancerous cells. The implication is that regular forest bathing could boost immune function and potentially reduce the risk of certain diseases, including cancer. To confirm that phytoncides were responsible for these effects, Li conducted laboratory experiments where he exposed human NK cells to specific phytoncides extracted from trees, compounds like alpha-pinene, beta-pinene, and limonene. He found that these compounds, at concentrations similar to those found in forest air, could directly increase NK cell activity and the production of anti-cancer proteins. This provided strong evidence that the health benefits of forest bathing are at least partly mediated by inhaling phytoncides. But the effects of forest bathing extend beyond immune function. Studies have consistently found that spending time in forests reduces stress. Measurements of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, show significant decreases after forest walks compared to urban walks. Heart rate and blood pressure drop. Muscle tension decreases. People report feeling more relaxed, more refreshed, less anxious, and in a better mood after time in nature. Part of this may be simply the psychological effect of being in a pleasant environment, away from the noise and demands of urban life. But there's also evidence for direct physiological effects of phytoncides on the nervous system. Some phytoncides have been shown to affect neurotransmitter systems in the brain, potentially increasing levels of serotonin and dopamine, neurotransmitters associated with feelings of well-being and pleasure. Certain phytoncides also have anti-inflammatory properties. Chronic low-level inflammation is implicated in a wide range of health problems, from cardiovascular disease to autoimmune disorders to neurodegenerative diseases. Compounds found in forest air, particularly certain terpenes, have been shown in laboratory studies to reduce inflammatory markers and oxidative stress. When people breathe these compounds during forest bathing, they may be getting a mild anti-inflammatory treatment, subtle but potentially beneficial over time. The concentration and composition of phytoncides in forest air varies depending on several factors. Different tree species produce different blends of compounds. Coniferous trees, especially pines, spruces, cedars, and firs, tend to produce particularly high levels of phytoncides, which is why forests of these species are especially popular for forest bathing. Deciduous trees like oaks, beeches, and maples also produce phytoncides, though typically at lower concentrations and with different chemical profiles. Phytoncide concentrations also vary with temperature and season. Trees produce more phytoncides when temperatures are warm, with peak concentrations often occurring in late spring and summer. Early morning and late afternoon, when temperatures are moderate and humidity is higher, can be particularly good times for forest bathing. However, even in winter, evergreen forests continue to emit phytoncides, and forest bathing in winter can still provide health benefits, though perhaps not quite as pronounced as during warmer months. Rain can enhance phytoncide release, as moisture triggers trees to emit more volatile compounds. So a walk in the forest just after a rain, when the air is rich with the scent of wet vegetation, may be especially therapeutic. The negative ions produced by moving water and vegetation also contribute to the sense of well-being people often report in natural settings, though the exact mechanisms are still being studied. For maximum benefit, forest bathing practitioners recommend spending at least 2 hours in the forest, walking slowly, pausing frequently, and engaging all the senses. Breathe deeply, allowing the phytoncides to fill your lungs. Touch the bark of trees, feel the textures. Listen to the sounds of birds, wind in leaves, water if there's a stream. Look at the patterns of light filtering through the canopy. Some people practice mindfulness meditation during forest bathing, focusing their attention on present sensations and allowing thoughts to settle. The effects are dose-dependent. A single short walk in the forest provides some benefit. Regular visits provide more. People who spend significant time in forests as part of their lifestyle, such as forest workers or those who live in rural wooded areas, tend to show consistently elevated NK cell activity and lower stress hormone levels compared to people who rarely visit natural environments. Importantly, the benefits of forest bathing aren't just individual. When people feel less stressed, healthier, and more connected to nature, they're more likely to support conservation efforts, to value forests, not just for timber or economic output, but for their intrinsic worth and their contributions to human well-being. Forest bathing programs have been implemented in many countries as part of public health initiatives, recognizing that accessible natural spaces are important infrastructure for community health. In urban areas where access to forests is limited, even small green spaces, parks with trees, urban forests can provide benefits. The effects may not be as strong as in a remote, dense forest, but research has shown that even relatively brief exposure to trees and greenery, perhaps just 20 minutes, can lower stress and improve mood. Some hospitals have incorporated views of nature and indoor plants into their design, recognizing that these elements can aid healing. There are also products designed to bring forest benefits indoors. Essential oils derived from trees, diffused in living spaces, can approximate some of the effects of phytoncides. Pine oil, cedar oil, hinoki oil all contain the same compounds found in forest air and aromatherapy using these oils has been shown to have calming effects and to boost immune markers, though perhaps not as dramatically as actual time spent in forests. The science of forest bathing and phytoncides is part of a broader recognition that human health is deeply connected to the natural environment. We evolved in close relationship with plants and forests, and our bodies retain physiological responses to the cues and compounds that forests provide. When we spend time in forests, we're not just tourists admiring scenery. We're engaging in a biological interaction, a molecular conversation between our cells and the trees, a conversation that can have profound effects on our health. The trees, of course, aren't releasing phytoncides for our benefit. They're defending themselves. But we've evolved to respond positively to these compounds, perhaps because in our evolutionary past, forests were important refuges, sources of food, water, and shelter. A physiological response that associated forest smells with safety and well-being would have been adaptive. Today, that ancient response still shapes our biology, reminding us that we are not separate from nature, but part of it, our health intertwined with the health of the forests that still cover much of our planet. Controversies and debates in tree communication science. As with any emerging field of science, the study of tree communication has generated its share of controversy. Not all scientists agree on how to interpret the evidence, and some of the more dramatic claims about tree intelligence, consciousness, and social behavior have provoked pushback from researchers who worry that the science is being overhyped or misrepresented. The debates center on several key questions. First, how common and how important is resource sharing through mycorrhizal networks? Second, can trees really be said to communicate in a meaningful sense? Or are we simply anthropomorphizing automatic chemical responses? And third, what does it mean to call trees intelligent, and is that term appropriate? Let's start with the question of resource sharing. The foundational studies by Suzanne Simard and others clearly demonstrated that carbon can move from one tree to another through mycorrhizal networks under certain experimental conditions. However, some researchers have questioned how widespread and how ecologically significant this transfer is in natural, undisturbed forests. A critical paper published in 2024 in the journal Nature, Ecology and Evolution, authored by ecologists Justine Cast and Melanie Jones, argued that the evidence for extensive resource sharing through mycorrhizal networks has been overstated. Cast and Jones reviewed the existing literature and pointed out several limitations in the research. One issue is that many studies demonstrating resource transfer have been conducted in controlled settings, like greenhouses or carefully manipulated field plots, where researchers use barriers to separate roots while allowing fungi through, or where they trace isotopes through plants in ways that may not reflect natural conditions. When isotopes show up in a neighboring plant, we know transfer occurred, but we don't necessarily know how important that transfer is for the receiving plant's growth and survival in the real world. Another issue is that mycorrhizal networks are incredibly difficult to map in intact forests. The fungal hyphae are fragile and ephemeral. When you dig up roots to study them, you destroy the very networks you're trying to observe. Genetic analysis can show when the same fungal genotype is present in roots of multiple trees, suggesting a connection. But this doesn't prove the connection is currently intact and functional. Hyphae can break, fungal individuals can fragment, and connections that existed yesterday might not exist today. Cast and Jones also noted that resources can move between plants through pathways other than mycorrhizal networks. Direct root-to-root transfer can occur when roots come into contact. Resources can move through the soil itself, leaching from one plant's roots and being taken up by another's. Distinguishing these pathways in experiments is challenging, and some studies may have attributed to mycorrhizal networks transfers that actually occurred through other routes. These criticisms don't deny that mycorrhizal networks exist or that some resource sharing occurs, but they suggest that the extent, importance, and mechanisms of the sharing remain uncertain and may have been overstated in popular accounts. Cast and Jones called for more rigorous experiments, better methods for non-destructively studying networks in the field, and greater caution in interpreting results. Suzanne Simard and others have responded to these criticisms, arguing that while the skeptics raise valid methodological points, the accumulated evidence from dozens of studies across multiple labs and ecosystems still strongly supports the existence and importance of mycorrhizal network-mediated interactions. They acknowledge that we don't yet understand all the mechanisms or the precise conditions under which sharing is most important, but they maintain that dismissing the phenomenon would be premature and would ignore a large body of consistent findings. This kind of scientific debate is healthy and normal. It's how science progresses, with initial discoveries prompting skepticism and critique, which in turn motivates more careful experiments and eventually leads to a more nuanced, accurate understanding. The controversy around tree communication is a sign that the field is active and vibrant, not that the core findings are necessarily wrong. A related debate concerns the language used to describe tree behavior. Terms like communication, altruism, intelligence, and even forest wisdom have been used by researchers and popularizers to describe what trees do. Critics argue that these terms, drawn from studies of human and animal behavior, are misleading when applied to plants. Communication, in the strict sense, implies an intentional exchange of information, where a sender actively transmits a message to a receiver with the goal of changing the receiver's behavior. But trees don't have intentions. They don't have brains or nervous systems. When a tree releases VOCs in response to herbivore damage, is it communicating, or is it simply a biochemical reflex, a side effect of its defense mechanisms that happens to be detectable by other trees? Some researchers prefer to speak of signaling rather than communication, with signaling defined more broadly to include any process where one organism's activity affects another's behavior, regardless of whether the effect is intended. By this definition, trees clearly do signal to one another, and receiving trees clearly respond to those signals, even if there's no conscious intent involved. The term altruism is even more contentious. In evolutionary biology, altruism refers to behavior that benefits another organism at a cost to oneself. Sharing resources through mycorrhizal networks might seem altruistic, but critics point out that the sharing is likely mediated by the fungi, which have their own interests, and that what looks like altruism might actually be kin selection, where helping relatives increases the donor's own genetic fitness, or it might be a mutualistic exchange where both parties benefit. And then there's the question of intelligence. Can trees be intelligent if they don't have brains? Some researchers argue yes, defining intelligence broadly as the ability to sense the environment, process information, make decisions, and adjust behavior in adaptive ways. By this definition, trees are intelligent because they clearly do all of those things. They sense light, water, nutrients, competitors, and threats. They integrate information from multiple sources. They allocate resources in ways that maximize growth and reproduction. They adapt their form and physiology to local conditions. Others argue that this definition stretches the word intelligence beyond usefulness. If every adaptive response is intelligence, then the term loses meaning. Intelligence, they say, should be reserved for systems that involve learning, memory, and flexible problem solving, of the sort that requires a central processor like a brain. Automatic biochemical responses, no matter how complex, don't qualify. These debates may seem semantic, but they have real consequences for how we think about and value plants. If trees are seen as intelligent, communicating beings with something like agency, then cutting them down becomes more ethically fraught. If they're seen as sophisticated biological machines, responding automatically to stimuli without any interior experience, then our relationship with them might be different. Some philosophers have argued that the question of whether trees are conscious or intelligent is less important than recognizing that they are integrated parts of ecosystems, that their well-being is linked to the well-being of countless other organisms, including ourselves. Whether we call it intelligence or sophisticated responsiveness might matter less than simply acknowledging that forests are far more complex, interconnected, and responsive than we once believed. Public interest in tree communication, particularly after the publication of books like Peter Wohleben's The Hidden Life of Trees and Suzanne Simard's Finding the Mother Tree, has been enormous. These books have captured imaginations and changed how many people think about forests. But they've also drawn criticism from some scientists who feel that the science has been simplified or sensationalized in ways that distort the findings. The challenge is that science communication always involves translating complex, uncertain, hedged technical findings into language that's accessible and engaging to general audiences. Metaphors like the Wood Wide Web or mother trees are powerful and evocative, but they can also mislead if people take them too literally. Trees don't browse the internet, and mother trees aren't literally nurturing their young with conscious intent. The metaphors are meant to help us understand complex biological processes by relating them to familiar human experiences. But they can create misunderstandings if not used carefully. Moving forward, scientists studying tree communication face the challenge of conducting rigorous research while also engaging with public interest. This means designing experiments that can definitively test hypotheses about mechanisms and ecological significance, while also being willing to explain their work in ways that non-specialists can appreciate. It means being honest about uncertainty and limitations, while still conveying the genuine excitement of discovery. And it means being open to revision as new evidence emerges, recognizing that our current understanding of tree communication is incomplete and will surely evolve as techniques improve and more data accumulates. The controversies ultimately reflect the growing pains of a young field. Tree communication science has moved rapidly from radical hypothesis to established phenomenon, but the details, the mechanisms, the evolutionary explanations, and the ecological importance are all still being worked out. The debates will continue, and that's a good thing. It means the science is alive, that researchers care deeply about getting the story right, and that our understanding of how trees interact and what they mean to each other and to us is still deepening. What this means for forest management and conservation. Understanding that trees communicate and cooperate has profound implications for how we manage and conserve forests. If trees are not isolated, individuals competing in a Darwinian struggle, but are instead members of communities that share resources and information, then forestry practices need to reflect that reality. Traditional forestry has often focused on maximizing timber production from individual trees or particular species. Forests were viewed as crops, and management involved clearing away undesirable species, thinning stands to reduce competition, and harvesting the largest, most valuable trees. Mycorrhizal diversity was rarely considered. The importance of old trees was primarily their timber value. The focus was on the trees you wanted to harvest, not on the ecological networks that supported them. But if forests are networks, then disrupting those networks has consequences. Clear cutting, where all trees are removed from an area, doesn't just harvest timber. It severs mycorrhizal connections, removes mother trees, eliminates the biological legacy stored in old trees and soil. When the area is replanted, the young trees have to start from scratch. Without the network support that seedlings in natural forests receive, they grow more slowly, are more vulnerable to pests and diseases, and may require artificial inputs like fertilizers and pesticides to compensate for the lack of natural nutrient cycling and defense priming. Alternative approaches are being developed that attempt to maintain network connectivity while still extracting timber. Retention forestry involves leaving some mature trees standing, especially the largest and oldest ones, to serve as biological legacies and network hubs. These retained trees continue to support regeneration, provide seeds, maintain mycorrhizal connections, and supply resources to young trees through the network. Studies comparing retention forestry to clear cutting have found that retained trees significantly increase the survival and growth rates of naturally regenerating seedlings and even planted seedlings. Variable retention harvesting can be designed to leave trees distributed across the cut area, maintaining at least some network connectivity throughout. This mimics natural disturbances like storms or fires, which typically leave some trees standing as survivors. The retained trees act as lifeboats, preserving genetic diversity, providing seed sources, and supporting the recovering forest through the vulnerable early years. Thinning operations, where some trees are removed to reduce density and allow others more room to grow, can also be designed with networks in mind. Instead of simply cutting the smallest or least valuable trees, foresters might consider which trees are most connected in the network, which ones are providing the most support to others. Removing highly connected hub trees could cause cascading effects, while removing more peripheral trees might have less impact on network function. Prescribed fire is another management tool that can be rethought in light of tree communication. Low-intensity fires, like those that historically burned through many forests every few years, reduce fuel loads and thin understory vegetation, but typically don't kill large trees. These fires can actually strengthen forests by selecting for fire-resistant species and age classes while maintaining network connectivity. High-intensity fires that kill all vegetation, including large trees, are much more disruptive to networks and lead to longer, more difficult recovery periods. In restoration ecology, where the goal is to re-establish forests on degraded land, understanding mycorrhizal networks can inform planting strategies. Simply planting seedlings in rows on bare ground often leads to high mortality and slow growth. But if the soil still contains mycorrhizal fungi from previous forests, ensuring that seedlings form connections to those networks can dramatically improve outcomes. Some restoration projects now intentionally inoculate seedlings with mycorrhizal fungi before planting, or they incorporate soil from healthy forests to introduce beneficial fungi. Mixing species in plantings, rather than planting monocultures, can also benefit from network effects. In natural forests, mycorrhizal networks often connect multiple species, and this diversity can provide resilience. If a disease affects one species, the network can help other species resist or compensate. Mixed plantings also tend to support greater diversity of mycorrhizal fungi, which can improve nutrient cycling and provide insurance against environmental changes. Climate change is altering forests around the world, and understanding tree communication may help forests adapt. As temperatures warm and precipitation patterns shift, the tree species that are currently dominant in many regions may no longer be well suited to future conditions. Migration, where new species move in to replace those that can no longer survive, is a natural response. But it takes time, often many human lifetimes. Assisted migration, where foresters and conservationists deliberately plant species that are expected to do well under future climates, is one proposed strategy. Mycorrhizal networks could facilitate this by allowing established trees to support the newcomers. If a Douglas fir forest is expected to become too warm for firs, but suitable for ponderosa pine, planting pines among the existing firs and allowing them to connect through the network could help the pines establish and eventually replace the firs as the climate continues to warm. There's also evidence that trees primed by stress can pass on adaptive traits to their offspring, potentially allowing faster than expected adaptation to changing conditions. Trees that have experienced heat, stress, or drought might produce seeds that germinate into seedlings better able to tolerate those same stresses. Supporting existing trees through stressful periods, rather than replacing them immediately with new plantings, might therefore be a strategy for promoting adaptation. Urban forestry can also benefit from understanding tree communication. City trees face harsh conditions: compacted soil, limited root space, pollution, heat islands. They often lack the network connections that support trees in natural forests. But intentionally fostering networks in urban settings, by planting trees close enough to allow root interactions, by inoculating with appropriate mycorrhizal fungi, and by preserving older trees as hubs, could improve urban tree health and longevity. Some cities are experimenting with structural soils that allow tree roots to grow under pavement, creating continuous rooting zones where trees can connect with each other. Others are planting mini-forests, dense native plantings, following natural forest structures, which establish network connections more quickly than scattered street trees. These efforts recognize that a city tree is more likely to thrive if it's part of a community, even a small one, than if it's isolated. Conservation efforts focused on protecting old-growth forests gain additional justification from communication science. Old growth isn't just about the trees themselves. It's about the intact networks, the accumulated biological legacies, the diversity of species that depend on the complex structure. Protecting mother trees protects the entire network. Allowing forests to age and develop complex structures creates resilience that can't be replicated in younger forests, no matter how well managed. There are also ethical and cultural dimensions to consider. Many indigenous cultures have long understood forests as communities, with trees as relatives, not resources. Western science is now, in a sense, catching up to traditional ecological knowledge that recognize the interconnectedness of forest life. This convergence suggests opportunities for collaboration, where scientific understanding and indigenous wisdom inform each other, leading to more holistic and respectful approaches to forest stewardship. The economic arguments for network-aware forestry are also strengthening. Forests that are healthier, more resistant to pests and diseases, faster growing, and more resilient to climate change are ultimately more productive and valuable. The short-term gains from clear-cutting and intensive management may be offset by long-term losses in productivity and increased costs for replanting, fertilization, and pest control. Maintaining network integrity could be seen not as a constraint on forestry, but as an investment in long-term productivity. Certification systems for sustainable forestry, like those run by the Forest Stewardship Council, are beginning to incorporate principles related to ecological networks and biological legacies. Standards that require retention of old trees, maintenance of native species diversity, and protection of soil health indirectly support mycorrhizal networks and tree communication. As the science becomes more established, these standards may become more explicit about network protection. Ultimately, the science of tree communication is changing our relationship with forests. We're moving from seeing forests as collections of timber to be harvested to understanding them as complex, living communities, where cooperation and communication are as important as competition. This shift in perspective has the potential to transform how we manage, conserve, and value forests, recognizing them not just for what we can extract, but for the intricate, beautiful, and essential roles they play in maintaining life on Earth. Closing reflections. As we come to the end of our journey through the hidden world of tree communication, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer wonder of what we've explored tonight. Trees, those silent giants that we pass by every day, are engaged in constant conversation. They speak through the soil, through the air, through electrical pulses and chemical signals. They share food with their children, warn their neighbors of danger, and remember the stresses of seasons past. They build communities that endure for centuries, networks of mutual support that help forests survive fire, drought, disease, and the countless other challenges that the living world throws at them. This isn't just fascinating science, it's a reminder of how much we still have to learn about the natural world, how much complexity and beauty exists in places we thought we understood. For centuries, we looked at forests and saw only trees. Now, we're learning to see the connections, the relationships, the flows of information and resources that bind the forest together into something greater than the sum of its parts. And there's a lesson here for us too. In a world that often emphasizes competition, individualism, and self-sufficiency, trees remind us of the power of cooperation and community. They show us that survival often depends not on standing alone, but on being connected, on giving and receiving, on supporting the next generation. The forest, in its own way, is a model of how life can work when individuals are willing to share, to communicate, to care for the system that sustains them all. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the forest outside your window, or the nearest forest wherever you may be, and think about the quiet conversations happening there right now. In the darkness, Electrical signals are pulsing through tree trunks. Mycorrhizal networks are shuttling nutrients from roots to roots. Volatile chemicals are drifting on the night breeze, carrying warnings and invitations. Mother trees are sending sugars to their offspring. The forest is never truly still, never truly silent. It's alive with communication, with cooperation, with the ancient wisdom of organisms that have been speaking this language for far longer than humans have walked the earth. Thank you for joining us tonight on Bedtime Biology, where we explore the quiet wonders of the natural world. If you found tonight's journey through the language of trees meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more episodes. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Is there a forest near you that you love? What did you find most surprising about the hidden conversations of trees? Your thoughts and experiences help build our community, and we read every comment. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that you're part of this great interconnected web of life, just as the trees are. The forest speaks if we're willing to listen, and perhaps in learning their language, we can become better stewards of the natural world and better neighbors to the trees that give us so much. Good night.